So the president of Nintendo had some really interesting things to say in a recent article. Shuntaro Furukawa recently was stating of what maybe we could be expecting from some new IPs for the Nintendo Switch and maybe some new hardware going forward of the Switch as well, maybe a revision or something going on there. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome, I'm Falcon Zero. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already, throw the master sword, the notification bell, and with that underway, let's talk about some new IPs for the Nintendo Switch and possibly a hardware revision. So let's start off with the new IP section of this, and looking back on most recently of what Nintendo's done with IPs, the most recent IP that they've done is ARMS, and then they have Splatoon, which is also a very new franchise for them as well, as that franchise is only like 6 years old, and we're currently in the works of a third game for Splatoon, which that's a very successful new IP for Nintendo, even so that like when you see the marketing campaigns with Nintendo now, like you see the Link and Zelda and the Mario and the Pokemon, Splatoon's usually right there too. So Splatoon has become very popular with Nintendo, especially over the recent years, especially because look at now, they have a third game. Now they also have ARMS for instance though too, which isn't probably the biggest IP that they wanted, but you know, it didn't turn out the best on how it was. But it was good for its time and it was a nice idea to see Nintendo try something new. Looking at Splatoon as a whole though too, Nintendo really switched up the third-person shooter perspective of there, as it was kind of starting to get just overcrowded with shooters in there too now, with like when we had so many Call of Duty games that were kind of just the same thing over and over, and Halo was a little falling off a little bit. Splatoon came out when we were like, do we really need another shooter game? But they switched the formula up so much, they made Splatoon a very relevant shooter game. It was so different than what we had seen before, and I think that's why Splatoon worked so well. And it was, you know, it came out on the Wii U, which wasn't even really that successful of a console. It wasn't actually that, it wasn't successful at all as a console, but Splatoon was successful on the Wii U, which was so important. It was why did they make Splatoon 2 and came out pretty early in the Switch's life for the second game, and now we have a third game in the works here. ARMS is another perfect example. They changed the fighting style of this game again. Now we're having arms that we're extending, and it was a kind of cool little boxing little feature that you could do too with the two Joy-Cons, although I did prefer to play with the Pro Controller, but they did try something completely new with the ARMS formula as well. It just didn't pan out like it did for Splatoon. But with looking at these new IPs, Nintendo's looking for new ideas to try to push on you. And that's what Nintendo is really good at. They're good at being creative, and that's what I want to see. Even though ARMS wasn't the game that we were all kind of expecting from a new IP, they tried something out of the box, and that's what I think that Nintendo is going to do again with a brand new IP. Also, it's kind of hard to pinpoint what Nintendo would do with a brand new IP, like what direction would they go, because they've done a fighting game, they've done a shooter game now. It's kind of fun to like, what would Nintendo really do next with a whole brand new IP and concept? It's really fun to think about. If you have any ideas, leave them in the comments below. And just because new IPs were on the drawing board of this little article here, that doesn't mean that they won't go revisit old IPs. Because when you take stuff and you think about like F-Zero, Nintendo might look at the F-Zero series and be like, we don't need to make an F-Zero game. We have Mario Kart. It's actually technically, as of right now, the most successful game on the Switch. It's the best-selling game that's out there. Why compete with it and put an F-Zero game out there when we already have a fantastic racing game? Which is true. But, you know, maybe they could take the F-Zero series and make it an action-adventure game on something like that, and they use the F-Zero series as it's not a new IP and it's an older IP, but at least it'll grab an audience towards it, and it's a little bit of a safer bet sometimes than like if they did something like ARMS. But if you put the F-Zero series on there, it could potentially have a little bit of a better start because there's at least some sort of following behind it, and you can like even take older IPs too, such as like Kid Icarus or something like that, or even Earthbound could be in that list, and they could just revamp those IPs, although it'd be cool if they still keep the RPG elements in Earthbound and just kind of revamp it and made it a brand new game. That's a little off point there, but it was like, that's what I'm talking about. They could also take these old IPs and then just kind of revamp these into newer ideas that weren't maybe how these franchises started per se. And also he talks about some hardware for the Switch, like saying he's always thinking about new hardware to push the boundaries forward on the technology of what they have. So the Nintendo Switch now is on its 4th year, and I think E3 this year could finally be the year that we finally get a new Switch Pro, Switch Revision that might be dropping during the holiday season. Who knows, the sequel to Breath of the Wild, that'd be a perfect way to push the hardware with that. And Legends of Arceus is around the corner, it probably will need the new Switch's power as well. I think it'll still run on both of those consoles, but it would be nice to have that little boost to help that game out as well. And I think with his little tease in the article here, you know, finally, I think E3 is the time that we can expect some kind of Switch hardware, and I think they actually need to push the Switch hardware too, and it's not going to be just like a beefed up version, it's going to be like a huge version overhaul where it's like it might actually support 4K, the resolution's going to be a lot better, the frame rate's going to be a lot better, and you're going to actually notice these differences. Yes, it'll still play the same games, but I think they're also going to make something that's actually kind of beefy and meatier, and they're going to try to do this, I think, as well, to just kind of keep the third-party support on there, because they need to keep up with the technology as well. The Switch is pushing 4 years old. The technology is getting a little bit outdated, and they can make it better. But I would also love to know what you guys think. I'm also going to be linking the article in the description below if you're curious about checking it out. If you like this video, please smash that like button as it really does help out. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell to stay up to date with more videos like this. And as always, everyone of YouTube, show me your moves.